So let me start off today by explaining how we're going to be doing it. I'm going to be looking at, firstly, just the introduction and manage a few expectations about the masterclass today. And then we'll dive right into it. We'll look at some of the main leadership theories that I want to discuss with you before we go into the influences on your personal leadership style. Before looking at some other examples and the effects of good and bad leadership, before we end up with practical tips to help you develop your personal leadership traits. And then, of course, the questions and the answers, as Wendy mentioned, we'll be doing that at the end. So just a little bit about myself. So my name's Hermina. I'm the Deputy Director of Global Education at Maastricht School of Management. And basically, I have a bachelor degree in creative therapy, a second bachelor degree in international relations and diplomacy. And in 2018, I completed my MBA, specializing in international business strategy. Now, I have more than 14 years of working experience in various domains and industries, but basically looking at sales and marketing, some project management, and in the last 5-6 years, I've been working on career and personal development as my main focus. I'm not an academic lecturer. This is not going to be the focus of the presentation either. This is a more career presentation and looking at it more from a practical point of view. So I do want to mention some of the situation. Basically, we have 45 minutes to maximum an hour. So it's very short, especially for such a massive topic. Leadership it's a very, very well-researched topic already. There are thousands of studies and articles and opinions. And so it is quite difficult to manage all of that in just 60 minutes. But on top of that as well, you are a very diverse audience. It's not as if I'm talking to a specific focus like just MBA students. And so obviously you all have your different cultures and experiences. And one of the big things about leadership is there's not just one way. And so this is going to make it a bit more complicated. So the solution is, I will look at some scientific studies and theories, but it's not the main focus today. Today, the main focus is just highlighting some of these, but then seeing how you can actually apply it and looking at some real experiences and observations. And so if you do want more in-depth knowledge on these topics, if this is something you think is interesting and you want to develop that further, you can join our executive education courses at MSM. We've got a personal leadership course from 12 to 16 April and effective team leadership course, which is the week thereafter in 2021. Okay. So now I just want to cover a few of the main leadership theories. And to start off, let's look a bit at the history of leadership theory. Now, in reality, obviously, leadership has existed since the dawn of man. Even in caveman times, there was always a leader. But the first people that actually started theorizing about leadership was, and actually wrote down about it, was Machiavelli and Sir Thomas More. And they both did it in the early 1500s. And they had very different opinions already then on what leadership should be based on. And according to Machiavelli, who was living in Italy in a princedom, leadership should be based on manipulation and deceit and bribery. And Sir Thomas More, who wrote a book on utopia, what is, in his opinion, this perfect leadership model, he worked more towards a consensus model. Now, both were writing in context of their situation. And so that's also very important in leadership, is understanding the context. Now, contemporary leaders, the theories that came to in this recent century, many are from the USA. And because of this, a lot of the theories are based on a participation model where the whole team participates in the decision making, but generally the initiatives come from the manager or leader. However, as I've already mentioned, context does play an important role, and so participation model does not work everywhere. So if we look at Hofstede, who created the 6 cultural models, he looked at different categories of a culture that differ depending on where you are. And once again, this is a whole different lecture that we could go into, looking at the whole cultural dimension of Hofstede. But basically, in countries like, for example, uncertainty avoidance, where they have high uncertainty avoidance scores, like in Germany, where they like their hierarchy, that participation model is not ideal as it would be in America. The same thing in China, where they have a high power distance score, where once again, the leader is very important and needs to make the decision. The participation model would not have that same effect. So it's always important to know this in relation to where you are. Now, if you do want to sort of figure out where you are in comparison to maybe if you've got an assignment abroad and you need to adjust, the first tool you can use is obviously Hofstede's cultural dimensions, but there's also quite an interesting one, Aaron Mayer, who's done a good country mapping tool where you can start seeing the relative difference between your culture and the culture you'll be working in. So if you are looking at something like that, it would be useful to become a bit more aware of that. Now, the types of leadership, there are many theories, but generally speaking, they have a tendency to overlap. There are certain characteristics or certain traits that some are more focused on people empowerment and some are more focused on tasks and achievements. And in the end, this is the two main ways to differentiate the approaches to leadership. However, I do want to highlight some of the few main important ones. The first one is the 7 transformations of leadership. And this was a theory brought about by Rook and Torbett, where they looked at how leaders react in a stressful situation and called these action logics. And so they created leadership development profiles based on these action logics. And then they analyzed how many people in leadership positions have one of these reactions. And so that's what is in brackets. So for example, 5% of leaders are opportunists, 30% are achievers, 38% are experts, and 1% are alchemists, for example. But they saw that also some of them were associated with more negative leadership results, while others actually had positive benefits. And the first 3, the opportunist, diplomat, and experts, are seen to be associated with negative outcomes, while achievers, individualists, strategists, and alchemists actually have more positive outcomes when they apply their leadership style. Now, these leadership styles, once again, are not always just bad. They can have some strengths in certain situations. And I'm not going to go through all of this in complete detail because this is not the aim of this masterclass either. But it is important to understand that, for example, an opportunist will always try to win. It's all about him. But this is good sometimes in emergencies when you need someone who can make a decision and not care about what other people think. So in sometimes being an opportunist can be an advantage, but generally speaking, it can be quite detrimental to the team effort. A diplomat, on the other hand, actually avoids any conflict and doesn't want people to not like him. So this person is always looking for ways to be approved by the group. Now, this type of person is very good for the glue in the group, but won't really stand up for things he believes in. And according to the research, diplomats are often junior leadership positions. So people that don't really dare yet to speak their mind, that are still uncertain and want that approval by the group. And so that's often a younger type of leaders. And then you've got your experts. And as we saw in the previous slide, that's actually the biggest group. 38% of leaders are actually experts. And the problem with that is often experts, someone that's really good in their job, gets promoted because they're so good in their job, but they get promoted because of the certain technical competency without looking at their leadership style. And then this person might be really good at contributing and making an excellent job of the objective, but is not very good in incorporating the team, because often this person is all about rational efficiency and not about team empowerment. So this is quite a common situation, especially in technical backgrounds and in technical companies. And then the last four, achiever, individualist, and strategist, actually these three are all based on achiever, but developing further and more towards looking outwards, transforming, empowering, teamwork, strategizing. And so these are all the type of elements that are very important in these categories. And the last one, the alchemist, is actually a separate transformation, because this person doesn't just look at the organization, it looks at society as a whole. And it goes above and beyond just making a difference in the company. And so that's why it's also so rare. It's very few people that achieve this alchemist leadership style. Now, another form of leadership, which a lot of people are familiar with, is the transactional versus transformational leadership style. And then a third one was added onto this, the laissez-faire style. Now, transactional leadership are people that basically create reward systems for meeting objectives. It's the traditional approach. And it works well for settled environments, for companies that don't need to change or to innovate. And it is also connected with traits that could be considered masculine, so competitivity, authority, and effectiveness. Transformational leadership, on the other hand, looks at more empowering people, trying to get people to develop to their full potential. People work towards a common goal. So the reward is achieving this goal. And it works really well for companies that need to go through innovation, that are changing, and that need to move through that change. Now, the leadership style is often more associated with woman characteristics like cooperation and equity and empathy. And finally, the laissez-faire leadership is basically the one who just says, look, you do what you want, I'm doing what I want, and he doesn't really concern himself with what other people are doing. So it's sort of like the opposite of the other two. But in general, most people will adopt a bit of both. So you will find that most leaders are not a pure transformational leader or not a pure transactional leader, but a combination of different elements of these leadership styles. An important topic that I quickly want to just highlight here as well is the difference between managers and leaders. In this presentation, I might sometimes refer to managers as leaders and vice versa. And when I refer to that, I mean more in a leadership role, a decision-making role. But there is also a clear difference between the need, the focus of a manager and the focus of a leader. And when I talk about leader, then I'm talking about the CEO, the board of directors, the person that's making the strategy. So they need to work actually hand in hand. The leader is the one that's going to come up with the innovating strategy, that's going to take the risk, that's going to be focusing on the major changes. And the manager is the one that's going to put this into place. So he's the one that's going to keep things stable while the leadership is rocking the boat. He's the one that's going to be loyal to what the leadership is planning in their vision, and the one that is going to find ways to mitigate the risks that the leaders are taking. So they really need to work well together if you want to have a powerful, growing company. And so it's not a good thing or a bad thing to be one or the other. It depends on the situation and it depends on your strengths. And so that's also important to understand and look at, are you more a manager? Do you like to keep things stable? Do you prefer working on standard operating procedures, ensuring that things are working smoothly in the team? Or are you the type of person that is making big changes, innovating, making strategies, and major changes? Another leadership model, this is one of the more recent ones, is the servant leadership theory. And basically, this is when you put others first and you empower your team to become self-sufficient and autonomous. And some of the traits, there are 10 traits that are important in the servant leadership model. The first one is listening. And you're not just listening to what is being said, but you also need to listen to what is not being said. So that's often the unsaid part of communication is extremely important. Self-awareness is vital in any form of leadership, but basically if you fail to ignore your own weaknesses, you also will be able to, or won't be able to develop the strengths of your own team, and you would actually end up exploiting the weaknesses of your team members, which is then a recipe for failure as well. Foresight is when you actually are thinking about what's going to come next. So you are thinking about the decisions you need to make and how to avoid mistakes that you've learned from the past. So it's always about thinking ahead. Empathy is very important in this model, also like with the transformational model, where you are need to understand your team. So you need to acknowledge what they are feeling. Connected to foresight is the conceptualization. And in this case, it's like with the foresight, you need to think outside of just the now. So as with managers that are focusing on the now, in the conceptualization, you are thinking more about the future and your vision. Now, relationships in this case were regarding the theory of servant leadership characteristics. They're referring to the fact that people are constantly trying to achieve a sense of wholeness. And this wholeness is personal and professional. And as a leader, you need to try and provide them with the necessary tools to achieve this wholeness. And you can only do this by listening to them and by being self-aware and by knowing their needs and being empathetic to those needs. Now, persuasion, sometimes people think that might be a form of manipulation, and it's not. It's not something you need to consider as a bad thing. Persuasion and influence is extremely important as a leader because you need to be able to create consensus. And this consensus is through communication, through talking, through listening. But it is very important to be able to persuade people to create that consensus in the team. As a leader, a servant leader, as I mentioned, one of the most important things in this leadership model is this empowerment model where you're focusing on growing your team members. And so the commitment to the growth is extremely important. What I mean with this is you're going to have to focus on, once again, their weaknesses and see what you can do to train them and develop them so that they can become even stronger in the task and even more confident in their commitment to the team. Then talking about the team, you need to create a community. Your team, it's not just individual people working together, but by developing and creating common goals together and working towards those common goals, you create a community. And this is really important if you want to have a successful servant leadership approach. And the final element in a servant leadership characteristic approach is stewardship. Now, this is where you need to manage your resources. And resources also include the people in your team. So you need to make sure that they're not overworked. You need to make sure that they have time to focus on themselves, that they have a healthy work-life balance, because all of this will be important to be able to achieve success as a whole. So this is quite an important model, and it's become quite, a lot of the leaders are actually using this nowadays. Some of the great leaders use or have a natural servant leadership style. So basically, if you look at it from an organogram point of view, the board of directors traditionally decided what was going to happen, and then people had to put into place, and then employees were the one, you know, on the battlefield, battling it out and getting those vision implemented. Well, here it's employees and the customers that add the value, and the managers and the board of directors provide them with what they need to be able to achieve this. So it is a different approach in employee empowerment. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning with the participation model, the problem with servant leadership and many of these leadership models is that often they're just taken out of context. So they're taken in one specific culture. And it is important also to be able to understand how can you adapt these type of leaderships in different cultures. And so the research has been done on that. And they looked at how cultures actually endorse the servant leadership model. And not surprising, some of these elements were not seen as important in certain countries. So if you look at the European and Scandinavian countries, they endorsed and found important the egalitarianism and empowering elements of servant leadership, while empathy and humility for them was least important. While in Asian countries, it was the exact opposite. Empathy and humility was very important in the Asian countries, while egalitarianism and empowerment was much less important for them. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't be a servant leader in an Asian country or in a European country. It's just knowing the importance of the various characteristics and adapting depending on the culture you're in. Another example is countries that scored servant leadership characteristics high, for example, was Australia, Chile, and Germany, while countries that found it even less than positive, so negative scores, was Taiwan, Ecuador, and Ghana. And this is because of the needs in that specific country, because of their cultural dimensions. These are the type of things that everyone would score differently. But just to summarize the servant leadership approach, if I have to quote one of my heroes, it's basically that a leader is like a shepherd. He stays behind the flock, letting most nimble go ahead, whereupon the others follow, not realizing that all along they are directed from behind. And for me, that summarizes what a good servant leader would do. Now, all of this I've mentioned several times is context will play a very important role. And the influence, you've got several different influences that's going to make a difference in your personal leadership style. And if you aren't aware of these influences, you're not going to be able to create or benefit from your personal development style. The first one is your personality. And we'll look at each one individually. The second one is the context. The third one is your actual behavior. And then the final is the gender. Now, personality, I mean, we all know what personality is. Basically, it's a genetic predisposition. It's engraved or encoded in your DNA, and it's basically results of how we deal with the world naturally. And it can be categorized to some extent. Some personality traits can be categorized. But it's extremely difficult to change your personality. People who try to change their personality will naturally revert back to their original self when they are put in situations of stress. Now, at the same time, I personally believe that you shouldn't be trying to focus on changing your personality. You try and focus on growing that. And we'll look just now at how that can be done. There are several personality tests that you can do. And these can be useful sometimes to get a better feeling of who you are, your self-awareness, maybe challenge some of the preconceived ideas you have of yourself. But in a lot of situations, companies rely on these tests too much. They end up using it as a crutch. And that's a pity, because these personality traits only look at a fraction of your leadership potential. And so it's something that should be considered in the context of several other elements as well. So talking of context, the context itself is an amalgamation of the culture in which you grew up. So these are your norms and your values and things that are very important to you. Impactful life experiences, things that you've learned through important life moments, your upbringing and the education you had. And then also the current environment that you're in. So the global affairs that's happening. COVID is having a big effect on everyone. Your personal situation, maybe you are in a stable relationship, or maybe you are traveling around the world. Everyone has a different situation. The country you're working in will also be affecting your context, as well as the company culture that you work in. And so all of these things will have a difference. But when you look at behavior is when your character and your context combine and influence you. So the behavior can change depending on your context. Since your character is pretty stable, the context will affect your behavior. And this is important to understand because if you can change your behavior, you can develop your leadership. So when you're focusing on leadership development, you should focus on leadership behavior. Because once again, depending on the context you're in, you're going to have to adapt that leadership behavior. And then finally, the fourth influencer is the gender. Gender does play a role when you look at the society, the way that society looks at the difference between women and men. Genetics and biology, the hormones, women react differently because of estrogen than men with testosterone to stressful situations, and also partly due to history, things that have happened in historical moments. And because of that, the gender will have to adapt as well. I mean, people are going to have to react depending on the gender that they are. You have to be aware of that it is an influencer on your leadership style. And if you look at Margaret Thatcher, for example, she actually had to go for vocal coaching because as a politician, her voice was too irritating and she was actually having a negative effect on the people listening to her. And so to be able to become more powerful, she had to go for coaching. They also, obviously, the whole maternal responsibilities in society, and as was mentioned with the characteristical traits of transformational and transactional leadership, it's natural fact that people are prone to different types of leadership, depending also on certain traits linked to gender. But when you combine all of this, you get the fact that you get your own personal leadership style. So basically, your character, the context you're in, your behavior that you've adapted, and your gender creates your unique blend of personal leadership style traits. And this is important to understand if you want to develop this further. So now I want to first look a little bit at that. I want to show some examples of people that have adapted to the situation, and then also look at the effects of positive and negative leadership styles. So one of the famous ones, political leaders. If I have to look at two very, very different styles, I would look at Obama and Trump, obviously. Obama could be characterized by being charismatic. I'd call him transformational. He led by integrity and often had more of a servant leader approach. He had a good communication style. And I think his slogan summarized it all. He said, yes, we can. And so he was participative and transformational, empowering people. Trump, on the other hand, was also charismatic, but he's much more focused on power. He's more directive, and he was focused on achievements, and also famous for being quite dominating. Now, Trump's slogan also summarizes him quite well. Let's make America great again. So the whole achievement focus was clear in that as well. If we look at some of the human rights leaders, people, all three of these I would classify as alchemists. And all three of them had, although they had their individual approaches, they were all three very well known for their vision and for their integrity. Now, Nelson Mandela, for example, was very motivational and empowering and was a very good example of a servant leader. And he led by example. So after the end of apartheid, one of the famous examples is how he embraced all cultures, and because he didn't want the same thing to happen in reverse after the end of apartheid. Well, Gandhi, also an alchemist, also a transformational leader, was very famous for good listening, led by example, but in a much more peaceful way. So Gandhi was a much more powerful, quiet, charismatic leader, but also a servant leader. And Martin Luther King, very charismatic leader, also famous for his integrity, but he was excellent as a communicator and had a very clear vision which he shared with people. And so you could also see he was a very good transformational leader. If we look at some of the business leaders, one of the things I would all characterize them with is vision. They all had innovation is extremely important for all of these business leaders. And but they all did this in a different way. So if we look at Bill Gates for me is an excellent example of how someone can actually change and develop their leadership. He went from being quite an autocratic leader, where he was famous for being a controller, to going to become more of a transformational leader, where he is now quite egalitarian and empowering his employees and making much more of a difference in society. Mark Zuckerberg is famous for his work-life balance, how important that is for him. He's quite an introvert, but he is a very good communicator. And his style is more collaborative. It's also appealing more to the millennial generation. Elon Musk is quite unique, often quite extreme in the communications and things he says. But he leads by example. He's a very hard worker, and he encourages failure. He wants people to try, because if he believes if you don't try, you won't succeed, but failure is part of that process. So he's a transformational leader in that way, clearly a very strong entrepreneur. And potentially, and this is something we'll see in the future, an alchemist, because he does have this transformational power of looking beyond just the here and now. And then we have Jeff Bezos, who is a visionary in his own right. He's more famous for being controlled, even though he has a lot of creativity as well. But important in his approach is the customer focus. So that is very clear in everything that he does. It's about the customer. And then the final category are our Instagram influencers. And these influencers shouldn't be underestimated. These top 6 Instagram influencers in the world have understood that leadership is also about influencing. And a lot of their opinions are having a strong effect on people that follow them. And so it's also important to understand that to be aware of this approach as well, and that leadership is also about influencing. So what are the effects of good and bad leadership? Now, here once again, I just want to highlight that when I say good and bad, it depends on the context, because what could be good in one situation would be bad in another. But this has shown, for example, in America, that managers that went abroad, 33% of them actually failed or underperformed. They were not able to deliver what was required. And 20% of them actually ended up returning earlier because they were not able to complete their mission, or they weren't able to adjust to the foreign country. In a similar way, it's been shown that 70% of global ventures worldwide actually fail because of this cultural misalignment and people not being able to adapt to the culture they find themselves in. So this is very, very important, and we will talk about this in the practical section just now. Now, one of the approaches also very strongly linked with servant leader and transformational leadership is creating an adaptive culture. And Kotter and Hesketh created this model when in 1992. And basically they said that leaders should focus on the changing needs of the customers and support initiatives that the employees come up with to keep pace with these changes. Now, they did a long-term study. For 11 years, they looked at the top 200 companies and surveyed them and showed financially how beneficial this adaptive leadership style can be. So basically, in all elements, revenue, growth in the workforce, the growth of the stock prices, and the net incomes, being in an adaptive culture had much more financial benefits than it being in a non-adaptive culture. And so in 2011, they updated this and they gave 10 tips on what you can do to build an adaptive culture in your organization. And some of them were already brought in from the original study, like creating a sense of urgency. But some of the others are elements that we have seen over and over again in the other leadership styles as well, like communicating consistently, encouraging your team to come up with innovation ideas and embrace the change. They also believed in being credible as leaders, so that integrity was very important to them. And then they also focused on the fact that all this leadership should be applied at all levels, not just at the top level. Also creating this autonomy where people can make decisions in a decentralized manner. And finally, this operating as a servant leader for them sort of summarized all of this and was a very important aspect of the adaptive culture. Now, 80% of problems in an organization are people related. In fact, leaders and managers often say they spend most of the time managing the issues of other people and not actually getting down to their work. But that is their work. So if you focus on your good leadership, it's going to have a benefit for the organization as a whole. But studies have also shown that the biggest effect on employee engagement is your immediate superior. So your immediate N+1. So your manager or your supervisor or your leader that's directly above you will have the biggest effect on your employee engagement. And that's also important to remember when you are a leader in your team, that your approach will have the biggest effect on your team. And if they're not happy, it might be a good time to reevaluate what you can do better. Now, this is actually corresponds with the challenge that leaders say that they have, is that 50% of leaders in the top 500 companies said that the biggest challenge for them was attracting and retaining skilled employees. So employee engagement is extremely important for a successful career growth, because it costs a lot of money to reskill, money and time to reskill employees or train new employees when they come in. And so keeping good employees and continuing to empower them and develop them is going to be an important aspect to your career success. So this has also been proven in another study where they found that great leaders will end up having 2 times more customer satisfaction. And at the same time, the employees, 20% of them will go that extra mile for a leader that they consider to be a great leader. At the same time, you obviously have the people that are bad leaders. And once again, this depends on the context. But in America, 40% of Americans that were interviewed consider their boss to be a bad boss. 40% consider them to be average, and 19%, only 19%, consider that their boss is a good boss. Now, this is extremely important because having a bad boss has a negative effect on your work environment. It's people feel that they're lacking in vision and direction. They find that the work is more stressful because of poor leadership, and they feel controlled, manipulated, and they feel like they don't have a voice in the company. And so the difference between good leaders and bad leaders is quite important. You can see that good people that work under good leaders actually enjoy going to work per day. They're less distracted at work. They don't have that feeling that they're not working to their maximum effort. And very important as well is that they don't have that feeling of negative energy in the workplace, which affects employees with bad leaders very, very much. So that is, in a summary, some of the important effects of employee engagement through bad and good leadership. Now, I'd like to just finish off with some practical tips, 9 tips, 9 themes that I'd like to discuss on how you can develop your personal leadership traits based on the theories and influences we've discussed in the previous sections. So the first one is power. Unlike the traditional approach and original theories on leadership. Power should not be the goal. Power can be extremely destructive to employee engagement because it ends up that you don't take advice because you are overconfident, and this has a negative cycle effect because you become locked in your own ideas, and this leads to negative work results. The cultural gap and bridging that is extremely important. As I've mentioned, it's probably one of the biggest challenges of leadership. So adapting to the culture. And this can even just be in your own country. The company culture already is a whole adaptation. And so a tip I can give is don't copy paste the best practices. Don't just do what you've always done that worked maybe in a previous company or in your previous country to where you are now, because as was shown over and over again, the culture are different. So focus rather on the intent of the best practice rather than just repeating it. And when I mean the intent, it's like, what are you trying to achieve through that best practice? And for that, you need to ask yourself the why. So to be able to know the intent of your practice, you need to ask, why am I doing this? Now, Mayer also created 4 useful rules that she advised to help people when they go into a new context, a new culture, company, or country. And the first thing she said was, don't underestimate the challenge. If you think that adapting to culture is easy, if you think that you are open-minded and flexible, and maybe you are more than the average person, it's still going to be a challenge. And if you underestimate this challenge, you're going to be closed to actually learning from the culture. And she also said that it's important to apply multiple perspectives. So the only way to actually understand the culture is by looking at all these perspectives. Now, how can you find out what these perspectives are? The best way is to ask. Talk to people in your team. Ask them how they perceive it. And if you don't talk, if you don't communicate, you're never going to get this, you're never going to make it clear what the various perspectives are. In the same way, when you are looking at these other perspectives, find the positive in each one, because it might be different to your approach, but it doesn't mean it's better or worse. It's just different. And so look at that and be objective as possible, and look at what's good in their approach as well. And then finally, it's about continuously adjusting your perspective. So continuously talking to the team members, because as with personality, your culture is so deeply rooted in you, you will go back to that until you've managed to completely integrate into the culture. And the only way to do this is to adjust and readjust your position constantly by talking to everyone. So communication is very important. And in this case, what I would recommend is that leaders really should be aware of the context. As mentioned, don't underestimate it. Be open to the culture. So look at their perspective, find the positives in there, adapt, and then also find similarities. And there are different ways of finding similarities, and we'll look at that soon. Now, employee engagement, as I've mentioned also just now, it's a very important part of career success. So if you want your team to succeed, it is important for the team to be engaged. And there are various ways to do this. And the people-oriented leadership styles, so once again, we're talking more about the transformational model, we're talking about the servant leader model. They all summarize some of these traits that are going to be very important. And so basically, first you need to focus on your team by providing them with respect and trust. You need to trust what they're doing. Constant communication, personalized relationships. So not every person in the team is the same, and you need to be able to adapt to each person and their needs, and give them the time by trusting them to work by themselves in a daily fashion, and even make part of, help them design their own task approach. And the same way, this is also linked to the servant leader model of community building. You need to create a shared ownership of the group goals. And that's going to be very important to create that team engagement, because everyone will be working towards the same goals. And then finally, if you do make changes, explain the why to the team. This is part of the communication process. Get their buy-in. If they think that maybe you've missed something, adapt. But it's important to discuss this with them and explain it clearly to everyone in the process. Now, finding similarities, as I've mentioned, is an important part of culture and adapting to culture. And this can be extremely useful to solve situations where maybe there are tensions in opinions. So when an argument rises, starting off with where the common ground is and then looking at what the differences are is going to be a better approach to solving the situation than immediately going out from the different perspectives. Now, something to remember, and that we often have a tendency to forget, especially when we're thrown into a culture that is as completely different to ours, is that as human beings, we all have common values. And one of these common values, for example, is respect. It's just that the respect manifests itself differently in each culture. So there's a difference between values and cultures. And so we all have these basic values inside of us, but the way we show them might be different depending on the culture. And that's important to always remember and look for what are these common values and how do they manifest themselves in the culture, so that you do understand it when it manifests itself. If you are involved in the hiring process, my advice is also to see if the candidate will fit in the team. So often people look at the qualifications of the person, the hard skills that the person can do, rather than the behavior and the personality of the person. And in this case, personally, I find that people, the team, the empowerment of the team, the community building works better when a candidate fits into the team from a personal perspective, and then to train the person and maybe the skills that they're lacking, rather than the other way around. Because if a person has certain skills but can't fit into the team, it can be quite detrimental to the team spirit. And once you have a team, it's important to get to know your team. And you can get to know your team through some team tests. So there's several tests like the Belbin test, where you get to see a bit the different roles of your team members. This is quite useful as well for your team members to see how other people work and function and what their strengths are. But also have some fun, do team building activities. This is quite an important way for everyone to just relax and connect outside of work. But it also can be team building trainings, like find a common goal, such as doing an Excel training all together, and in this way growing as a team in certain common skills. And finally, something that we in our team do together is a birthday lunch tradition. So instead of giving a birthday gift to someone when it's their birthday, we treat the person to a lunch. And so we as a team pay for that person's lunch whose birthday it is. But it gets us outside of the office, it gets us to connect and go out and talk. And once again, it's an opportunity, it's a tradition where every month when it's someone's birthday, we get out there and we break away from just work talk. And this can be quite a nice way to find common ground and get to know where you have common hobbies and stuff that you can do together. So another quote from Nelson Mandela, where just in summary, basically he's saying that it's when people are doing well, let them celebrate, lead from behind. But as a leader, it's also important to know when they're in danger, it's your responsibility to be in the front to protect them. And it's important to not forget this as well. Now, some tips for being a servant leader, some practical tips. First one is being an active listener. So as mentioned, don't just listen, but actually repeat what they're saying, summarize, and make sure that you have understood what they are trying to say. Ask questions. By asking questions, you are avoiding giving orders, and together you find a solution rather than it being a top-down approach. Respect your team, respect their competences, and in this way you can approach them as well as equals. Don't forget that you do have personal biases. We all have personal biases, and being aware of this, your self-awareness will help you with that. And as Matt mentioned now, with the team approach, it is important to focus on the positive environment, because having a positive environment will ensure employee engagement, and employee engagement will result in a better result financially and motivationally for the whole team. So talking about motivation and empowerment, the next step is looking at happiness, because the strongest motivator in a team is happiness. And one of the ways to ensure happiness is to make sure that people actually feel that they are comfortable and capable of doing the tasks. And the best way to do this is to reorganize the team so that the tasks are based on talents rather than just pure task description as the traditional approach. Also, don't forget to say thank you. Show your appreciation to the team in simple ways, like when they send an email, when they write a report, thank them for it. Send an email saying, great work, thank you. It goes a long way. In the same way, give them feedback. If something you feel they can improve on, take the time to do this. And if you feel that they need extra trainings, give them the time to do those trainings. So as a leader, you'll have certain visions, you'll have certain things that they will need to be able to achieve. And sometimes they might feel that they don't have the skills to do that. And it's up to you to empower them through either yourself training them or sending them on trainings so that they can accomplish these goals. And in the same way, these accomplishments should be seen as a team achievement rather than an individual achievement. And in this way, if you've got a happy team that is motivated, you're going to get better results, and that's going to result in career growth for everyone. Self-awareness is key, and I have mentioned the self-awareness several times. It's not easy to accept your weaknesses. So be honest with yourself. Try and get feedback from your family, from your team, from your supervisor, and from your friends to get a 360-degree feedback. Do some psychometric tests if necessary to get a bit of a feeling for your personality and behavioral traits. And also, don't see your weaknesses as a weakness, but rather as a development point. Because in some situations, in some contexts, a weakness isn't a weakness. For example, some people think being quiet is a weakness, but it can be a very, very powerful trait if you use it to listen to everyone and then jump in right at the correct moment and show that the consensus through the fact that you've been listening to what everyone is saying. And you don't need to be an expert in everything. Don't try to be an expert in everything. Accept your limitations and share this with your team, because they'll appreciate that honesty as well. In the same way, linked to that is embrace your uniqueness. Don't try to be someone that you're not. And if you combine your passion and your purpose and your skills, you will make an impact. And so the last thing in this section I would want to leave with you is ask these 8 questions to yourself. So when you get this recording, go through this again and take the time to ask yourself, why do I want to be a leader? And in my field, do I need to be an expert, or is my general leadership skills sufficient? Do I work better at the front or behind the scenes, and why? This is an honest question you should ask yourself. How important is work-life balance to me, and how will this decision impact my career? How comfortable am I to share leadership, so being part of a participative form of leadership? Am I more suited to be a leader or a manager? And why would anyone want to be led by me? This is an important question to be more self-aware. And then finally, what legacy do I want to leave behind? So that's quite a deep thought question that I'll leave with you. And the final tip for today is not one that we're going to talk about a lot, because I think this would make an excellent topic for a future masterclass. But it's also to think ahead about the challenges of the future. because the future leader is going to have the whole technological environment that's going to have a very big impact on the leadership skills. And you can already prepare for this by adapting to technology, thinking about how the future is going to change, working on upskilling yourself and your team. In this way, you can start preparing for the future digital transformation that is heading our way. Voila. That's all from the presentation point of view. So now it's time for question and answers. Wendy.
Yes, Amina. Well, I submitted all the questions to you. Did you receive them?
Let me check.
Chat, and otherwise I will do it again.
I see there's, I've got them, yeah. Let me just open it wide. Let me stop the share. Okay, now I can see everyone as well. Hello, everyone. So the chats, okay. So on servant leadership characteristics, commitment to growth of others. Is it by focusing on the weakness of the team member and sort it out, or focusing on the strength and leveraging them further? Good question. In this case, it really depends on the task. It depends on the context. So once again, there is no right or wrong answer regarding whether you should be focusing on the weakness or the strength. Generally, I would say it's a combination of both. So basically, you should be trying to put your team members in situations where they are working based on their talents as much as possible. But obviously, you can't avoid that. None of us are perfect. And so there will be weaknesses even when we're working on our talent-based tasks. And so if there is a weakness that is preventing us from doing our work even better, I would recommend sending that person on a training for that as well. So it's actually finding that balance between the two. Okay, let's see. Which leadership skills leads to high financial performance in companies from research? I'm not sure. Basically, I'm assuming it's depending on what company, just generally based on the research, what's leadership styles are having a positive effect. And the answer, once again, it depends on the context. It sounds a bit repetitive, but it really is. That's why I wanted to really highlight how important context is and how you as a leader need to adapt to the context. Because if you, studies have shown over and over again that the servant leadership model, the participative model, it's much more long-term effect. It's going to have a very positive change. People are going to be much more willing to go with the whole change experience. So it's also very important in change management to use this type of leadership. But if you're in a country where participative models, where a leader should be making the decisions, the employees are going to struggle much more to adapt to that type of style. And so you're first going to work around that and establish, and once again, that's why I say you need to look at the intent of your approach then, rather than just copy pasting your best practices of that leadership approach. So that's why there is no right or wrong leadership style. It really depends on the context in which you're applying it. But generally speaking, if you can find a way, whatever culture you're in, to get your employees to feel empowered and to feel that they can participate in the decision making, the results will be better. Let's see. So nearly every job listing nowadays lists leadership and or certain soft skills as requirements. How can you talk about this in interviews, especially if you haven't had leadership roles before? Very good question. And this is where I don't know if you've heard of transferable skills, but transferable skills are basically skills, the soft skills you've learned in previous jobs, that even when you're applying to a job and you're looking at different tasks with different descriptions, you can still transform those skills and say you've experienced it. So one of the skills is communication. Communication is an extremely important leadership skill. And in most jobs nowadays, you need to communicate. You need to communicate with team members. You need to communicate with the other departments. You need to communicate with your superior and inferiors, and with the external stakeholders. And so once again, that's an example where if they ask about experiences, you need to think about those type of skills. So communication is one of the skills that you've developed. And then try and use the STAR method, where you show them a situation and a task and an action and a result of how good communication in your job resulted in a positive result. So that's, you know, there are a lot of type of transferable skills like that. And if you look at the traits that I showed now about good and bad leaders, or the people-focused leadership or task-focused leadership, take some of those, depending on the job you're applying for, depending on the context, and give them concrete examples of how you've experienced some of these yourself. So I hope that helps. Should a leader give incentives to motivate staff members? And if so, should it be done regularly? Okay, that question goes directly back to the difference in the transactional leadership approach and the transformational leadership approach. If you're in a context where the company is in a stable situation, and more of a traditional type of company, then it is more natural, and people will be expecting that type of approach. You know, they will be motivated by incentives. If you're in a more innovative, fast-moving, changing environment, then you want to attack it with a transformational approach, and then you're not focusing on incentives, because then you're focusing more on this team accomplishment of all together achieving this company goal. And so that's also a difference in approach depending on the situation of the company and the context, once again. Okay, so is leadership a skill or a competency? Personally, like I've mentioned, you've got those 4 influencers. And so basically you've got the combination of skill, so what you've learned through your life experiences, and your natural competencies, so your behavior and your personality, as well as your gender. And so in combination, you're going to get your personal leadership style. And so some people will be more skill-based and some people will be more competency-based. But in my opinion, you can be both. Okay. Let me see here. This question is cut off. Let me see, I see more questions. Let me go down. Are there any other questions? Because I see one was cut off. I'm not sure what that was. Let me see.
I will send you a few more, Amina. I have them here.
Oh, challenging one. How can I optimize my leadership traits in the midst of bureaucracy, especially in the public service? My advice, just quit and, you know, go to another job. No, I'm joking, I'm joking. That's a very good question. Yeah, someone else had the same thought of me. So once again, even if you find yourself in a bureaucratic situation, try to make the best of the situation. If you're in the team, in that case, it might be a more traditional team, because obviously you're not working toward innovation, but you can still get some participation effects in. So as a team, you can think about the future, you can set goals together. You can redivide the tasks within your bureaucratic team, so that some people are maybe better at Excel sheets and some people are maybe better at, you know, speaking to customers or people the whole day. And so reevaluate that, for example. That could be one way to improve the situation within that context. Obviously, you can't be as innovative and visionary in a public bureaucratic environment. And in that case, then maybe focus more on your management skills. And that's where, once again, being a manager is also really important, and making those improvements within the team can also be done, even if you are in a situation where it's much more regulated than than in a private sector. Okay, a good question here again is about leadership and how it's often visualized as men, even though we're trying to fight these gender stereotypes. Do I have any recommendation for women leaders? That's an excellent question. And it's a whole different topic. We could once again do a whole masterclass just on leadership for women. But one of the things that I think is applicable in either case, if you're a man or a woman, is firstly self-awareness. So know your strength as a woman and as a man. Naturally, even though women are more empathetic and have a tendency to collaborate easier because they don't have that natural pride and competitivity of men in general, naturally women also have a tendency to micromanage. And so it's a weakness that women have, and that sometimes it might be good to work on that. If you know that this is something that's a personal weakness, it might not be, but it's maybe good to be aware of that. Another thing I would recommend is there are some excellent TED Talks and literature nowadays about that. As a business school, we ourselves have a challenge of teaching in a way that we don't subconsciously focus on male-oriented leadership skills. And an example of this is in case study. In fact, case studies have shown, when they did an analysis of case studies, that I think 95% of the case studies subconsciously use men as the protagonists. So the man is the leader in the case study. And these are ways that even business schools are continuing this focus on men-styled leadership. And so I do think there's a lot of things that society can do. There's a lot of things that people can do. But also as a person, as a woman yourself, it's also good to know about your own strengths and weaknesses. Use the collaboration, use the empathy, and be aware of maybe some danger of micromanagement, and give employees a bit more autonomy. But once again, it depends on every single person. Maybe one more question. For a fresh starting in the innovative company, okay. Should the leader micromanage, force hierarchy, or should the leader give more freedom and time for the members to perform their task? Okay, so the first answer, once again, in this situation, is depends on your context. If you're in China, you're going to react to this very differently to if you are in Europe. So once again, the cultural context is going to play a very important role in this company approach. However, if you have a startup and you are focusing on innovation, obviously you want to be more entrepreneurial, you want to push forward, you want people to be constantly changing. And if that's going to be the important goal, you need a flexible approach, you need this agile way of working. Then being more of a people-focused leader rather than a task-focused leader will, if you can create that culture from the beginning, in the long run, that's going to help you much more. So hopefully that helps in that approach, just in a nutshell. So if you can, go for that leadership, that personal leadership approach where you help the people empower themselves. And then as an innovative company, it's going to be great.